The snow fell like white bullets from the angry sky. Thomas Mercer stood at his barn door and looked out at his ranch. Everything was white. The fences were buried. The trees were covered. The whole world looked like it was dressed in a frozen blanket. Thomas was a simple farmer. He lived alone on his small ranch in the middle of nowhere. He had 20 cattle, some chickens, and a life that was quiet and hard. But today was different. Today was dangerous. The blizzard had started 3 hours ago. It came fast and mean, like a wild animal attacking from the mountains. Thomas had counted his cattle before the storm hit. He had 20, but when he counted again an hour ago, he only found 17. 3 were missing. Lost somewhere in the white madness outside, he could not leave them out there. They would freeze. They would die. Thomas pulled his heavy coat tighter around his body. He wrapped a thick scarf around his face. He put on his worn leather gloves. His hands were already shaking from the cold inside the barn. Outside would be worse, much worse. His old dog, Copper, whined at his feet. The dog did not want him to go. Animals know when danger is close. Copper looked up at Thomas with sad brown eyes that seemed to say, "Stay here. Stay safe." But Thomas shook his head. "I have to go, boy," he said softly. "Those cattle need me." He stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a punch to the chest. Thomas could barely breathe. The cold burned his lungs. Snow flew into his eyes, making everything blurry and white. He could not see more than a few feet ahead. Every step forward felt like walking through thick mud. The snow was already up to his knees. His legs hurt with every movement, but he kept going. He had to find those cattle. Thomas walked for what felt like hours. Time moved strangely in a blizzard. Minutes felt like years. His body grew more tired. His fingers went numb inside his gloves. His face felt like ice. He started to think maybe he should turn back. Maybe the cattle were already gone. Maybe he was risking his life for nothing. Then he heard something. A sound that did not belong to the storm. It was faint, distant, but it was there. A cry, an animal cry. But it was not a cow. It was something else. Thomas stopped walking. He stood perfectly still and listened. The wind screamed around him. The snow hit his face. But there it was again. A whinny, a horse sound. But it was filled with pain, with fear, with desperation. Thomas turned toward the sound. His heart began to beat faster. There were no horses on his ranch. He did not own any horses. So what was out here? What was making that terrible sound? He pushed forward, fighting against the storm with new energy. The sound grew louder, more desperate. Thomas climbed over a small frozen hill. His boots slipped on the ice. He fell once, his hands sinking into the deep snow. But he got up and kept moving. The crying was close now, very close. And then he saw them. 2 horses stood in the middle of the white wasteland. They were wild Mustangs. Thomas could tell by their rough coats and powerful bodies. One was dark brown, almost black. The other was gray like smoke. But something was terribly wrong. The horses were not running. They were not moving at all. They stood completely still, their heads hanging low. Their bodies shook violently. And then Thomas saw why. Chains. Heavy iron chains wrapped around their necks and front legs. The chains were attached to a thick wooden post that had been driven deep into the frozen ground. The horses were prisoners, trapped, left to die in the storm. Thomas felt his stomach turn. His heart broke inside his chest. Who would do this? Who could be so cruel? He moved closer. The horses saw him and tried to pull away. They were terrified. The dark horse pulled so hard that the chain cut deeper into her neck. Blood dripped onto the white snow, creating small red spots. The gray horse made a sound that Thomas would never forget. It was not just fear. It was a plea, a cry for help. These animals had been here for a long time, maybe days. Their bodies were covered in ice. Their legs trembled from exhaustion and cold. The wounds from the chains were deep and infected. Frozen blood stuck to their fur. Thomas dropped to his knees in the snow. Tears froze on his cheeks. He had seen many hard things in his life. He had lived through brutal winters, lost crops, and endless loneliness. But this was different. This was pure evil. Someone had chained these beautiful wild creatures here and left them to suffer, left them to freeze, left them to die alone in the storm. A dark mare fell. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed into the snow with a heavy thud. A gray stallion tried to move closer to her, but his chain held him back. He made another desperate sound. Thomas could see it in the stallion's eyes. The horse was trying to protect his companion. Even in his own pain, even in his own dying moments, he wanted to help her. Thomas pulled off his gloves. His fingers were red and frozen, but he did not care. He reached out slowly toward the dark mare. She flinched, but did not have the strength to pull away. Thomas touched her neck gently. Her skin was like ice. She was dying right in front of him. They both were, and Thomas knew he had only minutes to decide what to do. The storm was getting worse. Darkness was coming, and he was miles from his barn.
Thomas looked at the chains. They were thick and old. Rust covered the metal, but they were still strong. Very strong. He grabbed the chain attached to the dark mare and pulled with all his strength. Nothing happened. The chain did not move. It did not break. It just cut deeper into the horse's neck. The mare made a weak sound. Thomas stopped pulling immediately. He was hurting her more. He looked around desperately. The storm was growing worse. The wind howled like angry spirits. Snow fell so thick that Thomas could barely see his own hands. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it in his bones. If he did not do something now, these horses would be dead within the hour. Maybe less. Thomas pulled out his pocket knife. It was small and old. He had used it for cutting rope and opening feed bags. But could it cut through iron chains? He knew the answer was no, but he had to try. He had to do something. He placed the blade against the chain on the mare's neck and began to saw back and forth. The metal was too hard. The knife barely scratched it. His hands shook from cold and frustration. This was not working. The gray stallion watched him. The horse's eyes were strange. They were not just filled with fear anymore. There was something else there, something that looked almost like hope. Like the stallion understood that this human was trying to help. The stallion took one small step closer, his chain rattling in the wind. He lowered his head toward Thomas. It was a gesture of trust. In the middle of all this pain and cold, the wild horse was choosing to trust. Thomas felt tears on his face again. He wiped them away quickly. Crying would not help. Crying would not save these animals. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The chains were attached to a wooden post. Maybe he could not break the chains, but maybe he could break the post. Thomas stood up and examined it closely. The post was thick, made from old railroad wood. It had been there for a long time. The bottom was buried deep in frozen ground. Thomas began to dig. He used his hands, scraping away snow and ice from around the post. His fingers burned with cold. The skin on his knuckles split and bled. But he kept digging. He dug until he could feel the base of the post. Then he pushed against it with his shoulder. The post did not move. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Thomas stepped back and kicked it with his boot. Pain shot through his foot, but the post did not budge. The dark mare was breathing very slowly now. Her eyes were starting to close. She was giving up. Thomas could see it happening. The life was draining out of her with every passing second. No, he would not let this happen. Not today. Not while he still had breath in his body. Thomas ran to a nearby rock pile. His legs sank deep into the snow with every step. He grabbed the biggest rock he could carry. It was heavy and cold. He carried it back to the post and lifted it high above his head. Then he brought it down hard on the chain. The sound of rock hitting metal rang out across the frozen land. But the chain did not break. Thomas lifted the rock again, and again, and again. His arms screamed with pain. His back felt like it was breaking. But he did not stop. On the seventh hit, something changed. A small crack appeared in one of the chain links. It was tiny, barely visible, but it was there. Thomas felt a surge of hope. He hit the chain again. The crack grew bigger. The gray stallion made a sound. Not a cry of pain this time. It was different, encouraging, like the horse was telling him to keep going. Thomas hit the chain 3 more times. On the 3rd strike, the link broke. The chain fell away from the dark mare's neck. She was free, but she did not move. She lay in the snow, too weak, too broken. Her wounds bled onto the white ground. Thomas quickly removed his heavy coat. The cold hit his body like knives. But he did not care. He wrapped the coat around the mare, covering her shaking body. She needed warmth. She needed it now. Then Thomas turned to the gray stallion. The horse stood tall, watching everything. His own chains still held him prisoner. Thomas picked up the rock again. His arms felt like they were made of lead. Every muscle hurt. His whole body was shutting down from the cold. But he had freed one horse. He could free the other. He struck the stallion's chain. Once, twice, 3 times. The stallion did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, as if he knew Thomas was trying to help, as if he understood that movement would make it harder. The trust between them grew stronger with each hit of the rock. 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, the chain began to crack. Thomas hit it again with everything he had left. The link shattered. The chain fell away. The gray stallion was free. But freedom meant nothing if they could not survive. Both horses were severely injured. Both were freezing. And Thomas himself was starting to feel strange. His thoughts were becoming slow. His body felt heavy and numb. He knew what this meant. Hypothermia was setting in. The cold was killing him too. He looked at the 2 horses, then looked back toward where he thought his ranch was. He could not see it. The storm had erased everything. He did not even know which direction to walk. The dark mare tried to lift her head. She failed. The gray stallion moved closer to her and stood over her body, trying to shield her from the wind. Even in his own suffering, he was protecting her. Thomas made a decision. He could not carry both horses. He could barely walk himself, but he would not leave them. If he was going to die out here, he would die trying to save them. He grabbed the rope from his belt. With frozen fingers, he tied one end around the stallion's neck, being careful not to touch the wounds. Then he tied the other end around his own waist. "Come on, boy," Thomas whispered through chattering teeth. "We have to move. We have to try." He did not know if the horse would follow. He did not know if any of them would survive the next hour. But he started walking into the white darkness anyway. Thomas took 1 step forward, then another. The rope around his waist pulled tight. He looked back. The gray stallion was not moving. The horse stood frozen in place, looking down at the dark mare in the snow. Thomas understood. The stallion would not leave her, could not leave her. They were bonded, connected in a way that went beyond chains and storms and survival. Thomas walked back to the mare. She lay motionless, his coat wrapped around her trembling body. Her breathing was so shallow that he could barely see her chest move. Thomas knelt down beside her. His knees sank into the frozen snow. He put his hand on her face. Her eyes opened slightly. They were dull and empty. She had given up. She was ready to die. "No," Thomas said out loud. His voice was weak and hoarse. "You do not get to quit. Not now. Not after everything." He did not know if the horse could understand his words. But maybe she could feel his determination. Maybe she could sense that he was not going to abandon her. Thomas untied the rope from the stallion. Then he did something that seemed impossible. He bent down and tried to lift the mare. She was heavy, so heavy. A full-grown horse weighs hundreds of pounds. Thomas was just one man, one freezing, exhausted man. But he wrapped his arms under her body and pulled. He used every bit of strength left in his muscles. The mare did not help. She was too weak. Her legs hung limp. Thomas managed to pull her a few inches. Then his arms gave out. He fell backward into the snow, gasping for air. His lungs burned. His heart pounded. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the gray sky. Snow fell onto his face. He could feel himself slipping away. The cold was winning. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how his story ended. Frozen in a field, trying to save 2 wild horses that nobody else cared about. Then he felt something warm on his face. Thomas opened his eyes. The gray stallion was standing over him. The horse lowered his head and pressed his nose against Thomas's cheek. It was a gentle touch. Warm breath from the horse's nostrils melted the snow on Thomas's skin. The stallion made a low sound. Not scared, not desperate. Something different. Something like encouragement. Thomas sat up. The stallion stepped back, watching him with those intelligent eyes. Then the horse did something incredible. He walked over to the dark mare and positioned himself beside her. He lowered his body slightly, bending his front legs. Thomas stared in disbelief. Was the horse trying to help? Was he showing Thomas what to do? Thomas crawled through the snow to the mare. With the last bit of energy he had, he draped her upper body across the stallion's back. The stallion grunted from the weight, but did not move away. He stood firm and steady. The mare's head hung down on one side, her legs on the other. It was not perfect. It would not work for long, but it was something. Thomas tied the rope around both horses, securing the mare to the stallion's back as best as he could. His fingers could barely work. They were purple and stiff. He could not feel them anymore. When he finished, he stood up. The world spun around him. He stumbled and almost fell. The stallion made that sound again. That encouraging sound. Thomas grabbed onto the horse's mane to steady himself. "Okay," Thomas whispered. "Let's go home." He did not know where home was anymore. Everything looked the same, white and endless. But he chose a direction and started walking. The stallion walked beside him, carrying the mare on his back. It was slow, painfully slow. Every few steps, they had to stop. The stallion's legs shook from the weight. Thomas's legs could barely move. The wind screamed louder. The storm was reaching its peak. Thomas could not see anything now. Not the ground, not the sky, just white, endless white. He kept one hand on the stallion's neck. If he lost contact with the horse, he would be lost forever. They walked together through the frozen nightmare. Man and beast, stranger and wild animal. But in this moment, they were the same. They were survivors fighting against impossible odds. Thomas did not know how long they walked. Time had no meaning anymore. His mind started playing tricks on him. He saw things that were not there. He thought he heard his mother calling his name. She had been dead for 10 years. He saw lights in the distance. But when he walked toward them, they disappeared. He was hallucinating, dying. His body was shutting down. Then the stallion stopped walking. Thomas tried to pull him forward, but the horse would not move. "No," Thomas begged. "We have to keep going. Please." But the stallion stood completely still. Had the horse given up too? Thomas looked at the animal's face. The stallion was not looking at him. He was looking at something ahead, something in the white wall of snow. Thomas turned and squinted. At first, he saw nothing, just more snow, more white. Then he saw it, a dark shape, barely visible through the storm. Something tall and solid. Thomas took a step toward it, then another. The shape became clearer. It was a building, a barn, his barn. They had made it. Somehow, impossibly, they had found their way home. Thomas wanted to cry. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to collapse. But there was no time for any of that. They were not safe yet. He pushed forward, the stallion following close behind. The mare hung limp across his back, unconscious or dead. Thomas could not tell. They reached the barn doors. Thomas pulled them open with hands that no longer worked properly. Warm air rushed out from inside. The smell of hay and animals filled his nose. They stumbled inside. Thomas closed the doors behind them, shutting out the storm. The sudden silence was shocking. Inside the barn, the wind could not reach them. The cold could not find them. They were safe. Thomas untied the rope with shaking hands. The gray stallion carefully lowered himself, letting the dark mare slide gently onto a pile of hay. She lay still, too still. Thomas collapsed beside her. His body had nothing left to give. Darkness filled his vision, and everything went black. Thomas opened his eyes. Everything was blurry. He did not know where he was. He did not know how much time had passed. His body felt like it was on fire and freezing at the same time. Every muscle screamed with pain. He tried to move, but could not. Something heavy was on top of him, something warm and rough. His vision cleared slowly. He was looking up at wooden beams, the barn's ceiling. He was still in the barn, and the heavy thing on top of him was a blanket. No, several blankets. Someone had covered him. But who? He lived alone. There was nobody else on his ranch. Thomas turned his head to the side. Pain shot through his neck, but he ignored it. He needed to see the horses. Were they alive? Had they survived? In the dim light of the barn, he saw them. Both horses lay on thick piles of hay about 10 feet away. The dark mare was on her side, not moving. The gray stallion lay beside her, his head resting near hers. Thomas's heart sank. They looked dead. Then the stallion's ear twitched. Just a small movement. But it was movement. He was alive. Thomas tried to sit up. His arm shook. His head spun. But he managed to prop himself up on his elbows. That was when he heard footsteps. Heavy boots on the barn floor. Thomas turned quickly, ignoring the pain. A man walked out from the shadows. He was big and old, with a thick gray beard and a worn cowboy hat. Thomas recognized him immediately. It was Hank Miller, his nearest neighbor. Hank lived 5 miles away. They rarely saw each other except when buying supplies in town. "Easy there, Tom," Hank said in his deep voice. "You nearly died out there. Copper found me." Thomas looked around and saw his dog sleeping in the corner of the barn. Copper had run through the storm to find help. Smart dog. Loyal dog. The horses, Thomas croaked. His throat was dry and painful. "Are they alive?" Hank interrupted. "Barely, but alive." The old man walked over and knelt beside the dark mare. "Found you passed out cold when I got here. You were blue as ice. Had to warm you up first before I could help these animals." Hank pulled back a blanket covering the mare. Thomas saw bandages wrapped around her neck and legs. Clean white cloth stained with blood and yellow medicine. "I cleaned their wounds best I could," Hank continued. "Gave them water. Covered them with blankets. But Tom, I gotta be honest with you. That mare there, she might not make it. She lost a lot of blood. She's real weak. Been lying like that for hours now." Thomas forced himself to stand. His legs wobbled. Hank grabbed his arm to steady him. "You should rest," the old man said. But Thomas shook his head. He walked slowly to the horses. Each step hurt. His frozen feet felt like blocks of wood. But he kept going. He knelt down beside the dark mare. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was so faint he could barely hear it. Thomas placed his hand on her neck, just above the bandages. Her skin was warmer now, but her heartbeat was weak and slow. "Come on, girl," Thomas whispered. "You fought too hard to die now." The gray stallion lifted his head. He looked at Thomas with those same intelligent eyes. The horse made a soft sound, almost like a sigh. Then he did something that made both men freeze. The stallion carefully stood up. His legs were wobbly and weak, but he managed. Then he walked around to the other side of the mare. He lowered his head and gently nudged her with his nose. Once, twice, 3 times. The mare did not respond. The stallion nudged her harder. He made a louder sound, almost like a call, like he was telling her to wake up, to get up, to fight. "He won't leave her," Hank said quietly. "Been doing that every hour, trying to wake her, trying to make her move." Thomas felt his chest tighten. The bond between these two animals was stronger than anything he had ever seen. They were not just horses. They were partners, friends, family. The stallion nudged her again, more desperately this time. Still nothing. Then, like a miracle, the mare's eye opened. Just one eye, just barely, but it opened. The stallion made an excited sound. He nudged her face gently, almost lovingly. The mare's eye closed again, but her breathing got a little bit stronger, a little bit deeper. "She's responding to him," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder. "She's fighting because of him." Hank nodded slowly. "Never seen anything like it. These are wild horses, Tom. They don't trust humans. They don't let us near them. But that stallion, he let me treat his wounds without fighting. He stood still while I wrapped bandages. It's like he knows we're trying to help." Thomas stood up and walked to a shelf in the barn. He found a bottle of medicine he used for his cattle. It helped with infections. He also grabbed clean rags and a bucket. "We need to change their bandages," Thomas said. "Clean the wounds again. Keep them warm." For the next several hours, Thomas and Hank worked together. They carefully removed the old bandages. The wounds underneath were bad, very bad. Deep cuts from the chains had gone all the way to the bone in some places. The flesh was torn and swollen, but there were no signs of gangrene yet. That was good. That meant they still had a chance. They cleaned each wound with warm water and medicine. The stallion stood still, letting them work. He flinched sometimes when the medicine burned, but he did not pull away. He trusted them. The mare was too weak to fight. She lay still as they treated her injuries. Thomas worked slowly and carefully. Every cut, every scrape, every wound got attention. When they finished, both horses were wrapped in fresh, clean bandages. Thomas brought them water in buckets. The stallion drank eagerly, but the mare would not lift her head. Thomas dipped his fingers in the water and let drops fall onto her lips. She did not respond. He tried again and again. Finally, her tongue moved slightly. She tasted the water. Thomas poured a little bit into his cupped hand and held it near her mouth. The mare's lips moved. She drank from his palm, just a tiny amount. But it was something. "That's a girl," Thomas encouraged. "Just a little bit more." He gave her more water. She drank again, slowly, weakly, but she was drinking. She was trying. Hank put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You did good, Tom. Real good. Not many men would have risked their life in that storm for wild animals." Thomas looked at the old man. "Someone chained them out there, Hank. Someone did this on purpose. Left them to die." Hank's face grew dark. His jaw clenched. "I know. Found the post out there when I was tracking back your path. Whoever did it, they're evil. Pure evil." The two men stood in silence. Outside, the storm finally began to calm. The wind grew quieter. The snow fell lighter. Morning was coming. Thomas looked at the two horses. They had survived the worst night of their lives. But the fight was not over yet. The mare was still in danger. The stallion was exhausted and hurt. They would need days, maybe weeks of care. But Thomas made a silent promise right then. These horses would live. He would make sure of it. They had suffered enough. 3 days passed. The storm had finally ended. The sun came out and turned the frozen world into something beautiful. Everything sparkled like diamonds. But inside the barn, the battle for life continued. The dark mare was not getting better. She was not getting worse either. She was stuck somewhere in between, fighting to survive. Thomas barely slept. He stayed in the barn day and night, watching over both horses. He changed their bandages twice a day. He brought them fresh water and the best hay he had. He talked to them constantly, his voice soft and encouraging. The gray stallion grew stronger each day. His wounds were healing. He could walk around the barn now without stumbling. But he never went far from the mare. He always stayed close, watching over her like a guardian. On the 4th morning, something changed. Thomas was bringing fresh water when he heard a sound. A rustling in the hay. He turned quickly. The dark mare was moving. Not much, just shifting her weight slightly. But it was the most movement she had shown since the storm. Her eyes opened fully for the first time. They were clearer now, more alert. "That's it, girl," Thomas said, setting down the bucket. "Come on, you can do this." The stallion immediately walked over to her. He lowered his head and touched his nose to hers. The mare made a soft sound back. It was quiet and weak, but it was there. Communication between them. A language of survival and love. Over the next hour, the mare tried to lift her head. She failed the first 3 times. But on the 4th try, she managed to hold it up for a few seconds. Thomas felt tears in his eyes. She was fighting. She was not giving up. The stallion stood beside her, making encouraging sounds. When she finally drank water on her own, Thomas had to sit down. His legs felt weak with relief and joy. By the end of the week, the mare could stand. It took her 20 minutes and 3 attempts, but she did it. Her legs shook terribly. The stallion pressed his body against hers, helping to hold her up. They stood together like that for several minutes. 2 wild horses who had survived the impossible. Thomas watched them with wonder in his heart. Hank visited every day. He brought medicine, food, and warm blankets. On the 8th day, he brought news. "I found out who did it," Hank said, his voice hard and angry. "Man named Dutch Carver. He's a horse trader, been known to be cruel. Apparently, he caught these 2 Mustangs about a month ago. Tried to break them, make them tame, so he could sell them." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. And when they would not break, he chained them out there. Hank finished. Left them to die. Said wild horses that won't be broken are worthless. I reported him to the sheriff. He's been arrested. Won't be hurting any more animals. Thomas nodded slowly. Justice had been served, but it did not erase what these horses had suffered. Nothing could erase that. The scars on their bodies would fade over time, but the scars in their hearts might last forever. 2 weeks after the storm, both horses were walking normally. Their wounds were healing well. The mare had gained back some weight. Her coat was starting to shine again. The stallion was strong and healthy. Thomas knew what came next. He had to make a decision. These were wild horses. They belonged to the open plains, to freedom. He could not keep them locked in a barn forever. One morning, Thomas opened the barn doors wide. Fresh spring air rushed in. The snow was melting. Grass was starting to show through. Life was returning to the land. The 2 horses stood at the barn entrance, looking out the world. Thomas stood behind them, his heart heavy. "You are free to go," he said quietly. "You do not owe me anything. You survived because you are strong, because you had each other." The stallion turned and looked at Thomas. Those intelligent eyes studied him for a long moment. Then the horse walked outside. The mare followed. They stood in the sunshine together, breathing in the fresh air. Thomas watched them. He expected them to run, to disappear into the distance and never return. That was what wild horses did. They ran. They were free. But the horses did not run. Instead, the stallion walked in a wide circle around the barn. The mare followed. They explored the ranch slowly, calmly. Then they came back to where Thomas stood. The stallion walked right up to him and pressed his forehead against Thomas's chest. It was a gesture of thanks, of trust, of friendship. Thomas wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and cried. All the fear, all the exhaustion, all the worry from the past 2 weeks came pouring out. The mare walked closer too. She stood beside them, her head lowered peacefully. Days turned into weeks. The horses never left. They stayed on Thomas's ranch. They were not tame. They were still wild at heart. But they had chosen to stay. They had chosen Thomas. Every morning, they would run across the fields together. The stallion and the mare racing side by side, free and alive. Then they would come back to the barn where Thomas waited with food and water. Thomas named them Storm and Shadow. Storm for the gray stallion who had been strong as a storm. Shadow for the dark mare who had been close to death, Shadow, but came back. The names fit them perfectly. Word spread about the horses. People came from neighboring towns to see them. The wild Mustangs who had survived chains and blizzards, who had chosen to stay with the man who saved them. Thomas never sold them, never rode them, never tried to break them. They were not his property. They were his friends. And friends do not belong to each other. They choose each other. Every single day for the rest of their lives, Storm and Shadow stayed with Thomas. They became legends in that part of the country. A reminder that loyalty can exist between man and beast. That kindness can heal even the deepest wounds. That even in the cruelest moments, hope can survive. Years later, when Thomas was old and gray, he would sit on his porch and watch Storm and Shadow run across his fields. They were older too, but still strong, still free, still together. And Thomas would remember that terrible night in the blizzard. The night when 3 lost souls found each other in the frozen darkness. The night when everything changed. The horses had taught him something important, something he would never forget. In this hard world, loyalty is everything. Love is everything. And sometimes, the strongest chains are not made of iron. They're made of choice. Storm and Shadow had chosen to stay. And that choice meant more than any chain ever could.